got a dog and his name was Blue. Bet you $5 he's a good dog too.
Greg Lake sat alone in a hotel room during a 1973 tour, reading the latest hateful comments by a rock critic calling Emerson, Lake and Palmer as stupid as their most pretentious fans and the world's most overweening progressive group. With each sentence, he could feel his face flush as his heart was pounding. He wondered what they had really done to deserve such vitriolic comments. If you dislike their music, fine, but the relentless bemoaning of their motives, twisting them into vicious personal attacks, were beginning to cross the line. They were getting used to the criticisms at this point, but it didn't begin like this. In fact, they were catapulted to the masses by many of the same publications not so long ago. So where was this all coming from? Greg Lake started guitar lessons at age 12 at Don Strike's guitar shop, where he met Andy Summers of The Police and Robert Fripp. Greg describes in his autobiography, Lucky Man, how Don Strike's cross-picking helped speed up the playing and influenced all of their sounds, which can be heard on The Police's Every Breath You Take, King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer's From the Beginning. It's during this period, at age 12, that Greg is inspired by the English folk song Greensleeves to write his first song. Greg had been in a string of bands touring England in an old converted ambulance when he left to go home to Dorset and work. That's when he got the call from his friend Robert Fripp asking him to join his new band. They were already signed by Decca and needed a lead singer. Greg jumped at the opportunity and moved to London. As the London music scene was moving towards concept albums, King Crimson embraced the idea. Their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, captured the moment. They shocked audiences when they performed 21st Century Schizoid Man by taking the room down to complete darkness, then suddenly a blinding strobe light effect to accompany the fast guitar. This, along with Robert's menacing death stare, left some in the audience disoriented. That would contrast with the delicate Moonchild, creating a surreal atmosphere. Rejecting the label progressive, Greg writes of their sound, "We simply wanted to be original and make art rather than commercial rubbish. We wanted our songs to mean something, but that didn't mean we were high-minded and thought we were superior to everyone else." Within 6 months, they opened for the Rolling Stones at Hyde Park during the Stones' first concert after Brian Jones's death in July '69, to an audience of 250,000 people. They received a standing ovation.
Yes, seed, blind man's greed. Poets solving 21st century schizoid man.
However, that high note was short-lived. Greg's last performance with King Crimson was at the Fillmore West in San Francisco in December '69, when they were on the same bill with The Nice. Known for their bombastic stage performances, with keyboardist Keith Emerson incorporating feedback and distortion. Emerson's theatrics included manhandling his Hammond organ, wrestling it and attacking it with daggers, which he used to hold down keys and sustain notes. The Nice's compositions included radical rearrangements of classical music and Bob Dylan songs. They played an instrumental rearrangement of Leonard Bernstein's America and set the American flag on fire, which got them banned from playing the Royal Albert Hall. After King Crimson's last performance, Greg and Keith met in the hotel bar and discussed how they like using European influences in their music. Before long, Keith says to Greg, "We should consider forming a band together." They recruit Carl Palmer of Atomic Rooster. It doesn't take long for Emerson, Lake and Palmer to come together as a trio and begin work on their first album. Rather than drawing from American blues, as so many other British rock groups had done before them, they looked instead to European classical music for inspiration. Greg elaborates, "By taking this approach, we left our mark on the history of rock music. Like King Crimson, we just saw ourselves as an innovative band who were going to break free from conventions of the industry. The experimentation we had done with our previous bands would be taken to a new level." When they are near to finishing their first album, they realize they're short 3 minutes needed to complete the 21-minute allotted running time. After racking their brains for ways to fill the gap, Greg drifts back in time. That's when the song he had written years earlier, back when he was taking guitar lessons at 12 years old, suddenly resurfaced. He offers up, "I have this little folk song I wrote when I was a kid." Greg plays the song for Keith and Carl. Keith suggests that Greg record it on his own and heads down to the nearby pub. Greg goes into the recording booth and begins to work on the song, when Carl eventually pokes his head in and offers to play the drums. Before long, they had their first take of the song, "Lucky Man." Greg describes the lyrics as a medieval fantasy he had as a child that have been wildly misinterpreted to be about everything from the JFK assassination to the Vietnam War. But they weren't. It was just a simple English folk ballad transformed into a powerful track to complete the album. When Keith returned from the pub, he suggested he finish the song by trying out the Moog synthesizer. This modern piece of music technology had just been delivered that day. Greg asks, "What does it sound like?" "I don't know." Keith went back into the studio and began to experiment with the sound until he came up with a fascinating swooping sound. Once they put it all together, they all knew they had something special.
When to fight wars for his country and his...
Former Moog technician David Van Covering praised Lucky Man as the instrument's big breakthrough in popular music. And later, MTV's Kurt Loder said, "Lucky Man demonstrated for delighted keyboard players everywhere that it was at last possible for them to blow amp-shredding lead guitarists right off the stage, if they so choose." Lucky Man combined a beautiful English folk ballad with modern technology in a way few songs ever had before. That approach, melding traditional forms with innovation, became a defining hallmark of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Almost overnight, they were hailed as England's supergroup, culminating in an appearance at the Isle of Wight Festival before a crowd of nearly 600,000, alongside legends like Jimi Hendrix, The Who, The Doors, and the Moody Blues. The following day, they were plastered across music publications and newspapers. Their debut album received mostly positive reviews as Lucky Man began to make its way up the charts. Their innovation in the studio followed them on stage. They experimented with theatrics to complement their sound of fusing classics like Bach with modern rock.
Jeremy Bender was a man of leisure, took his pleasure in the evening sun, finally decided to become a nun.
They follow up with the innovative album Tarkus. It received generally unfavorable reviews from the critics upon its release. However, the fans disagreed. Tarkus went to number 1 on the UK albums chart, and it was a top 10 album worldwide, including the US. Rolling Stone said, "Tarkus records the failure of 3 performers to become creators. Emerson, Lake and Palmer will continue turning out mediocrity like Tarkus until they discover what, if anything, it is that they must say on their own and for themselves." From this point forward, the press narrative hardened, with critics increasingly framing ELP as representative of progressive rock's excesses, pretentious and highbrow. In the face of this, they can choose to continue down the path of innovation or heed the warnings of the critics who made it clear that they were not receptive to this new emerging sound now labeled progressive rock. Their decision was to soldier on. The more hatred from the critics, the more experimental they got. Their fans ate it up as their star grew brighter.
We're going to give you pictures at an exhibition.
Pictures at an Exhibition, a live album, was released in the UK in November '71. It features the piano suite by Modest Mussorgsky, performed at Newcastle City Hall. The album concludes with the concert's encore, Nut Rocker, a rock adaptation of the Nutcracker. While the album reached number 3 in the UK, some critics were not impressed. While the Melody Maker Poll Awards gave them the Best Group of the Year in the UK, in America there was a growing number of rock critics beginning to rail against the excesses of progressive rock, labeling it pompous and elitist. Emerson, Lake and Palmer were enemy number 1 of critic Lester Bangs. Robert Christgau gave the album a D+, and Lester Bangs, writing for Rolling Stone, brutally mocked their attempt at recording a classical suite. Because the whole grand sprawling mess that's Emerson, Lake and Palmer at their best comes gushing out. Not only a reprise of Whiz and Whirl, but also Boink and Grr. Feedback and applause falling together like the walls of the Red Sea right after Moses' troops tramped through.
There might have been things I missed, but don't be unkind.
When they released Trilogy in 1972, the album was a commercial success, reaching number 2 in the UK and number 5 on the US Billboard 200. From the Beginning was released as a single in August 72 and became the band's highest charting US single. Once again, Greg's folk approach combined with Keith's Moog synthesizer paid off. By this point, Lester Bangs is open about his hatred for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and his review of Trilogy. Musical sterility at its pinnacle, and having absolutely no soul, no feeling in the music.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside.
When they released Brain Salad Surgery, Robert Christgau reviewed the album harshly, most notably giving it a very low C- rating. Christgau often referred to the band as stupid as their most pretentious fans and the world's most overweening progressive group. In Melody Maker's January 1974 issue, Chris Welch addresses the criticisms and the band's reaction. In the case of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, like Led Zeppelin before them, they have soared perhaps too quickly to the heights for some to accept, and there is no doubt that their music is not to everyone's taste. Brain Salad Surgery, their latest album, has been somewhat coolly received by the critics. Perhaps ELP have drunk too deeply of the cup of fame, but it should not obscure the fact that ELP have worked harder than most to achieve their individual standards of musicianship and collective success. They have produced some of the most exciting instrumental rock music of the 70s, and that has struck a responsive chord in audiences across the world. Perhaps ELP shouldn't be so flashy, but they deserve better treatment. Just prior to receiving their award, Keith Emerson, Carl Palmer, and Greg Lake gathered in their office. They seemed shaken but not stirred by press hostility. They wouldn't let on about their plans for the year and seemed much more reserved than ELP of old. But they laughed a lot and seemed to have transcended into a higher state of awareness. They have been hurt, but bore no grudges. Greg read the latest reviews as he sat quietly alone in his hotel room in New York, contemplating their upcoming show. And lucky man, he eloquently details the highlight of his career during their performance at Madison Square Garden in December 1973. As we came towards the end of the show, we performed Pictures and Exhibition, and during the Tubular Bell section, right before the huge climax of The Great Gates of Kiev, we diverted away and I sang the Christmas carol, Silent Night. As I began to sing, the entire stage fell into darkness, and rising up, the Harlem Gospel Choir appeared and joined in. I can still remember the hair standing up on the back of my neck. Just to add to the emotion, snow started to fall inside the whole of Madison Square Garden just as the last verse began. It was probably the most spectacular single stage production I have ever been involved in. The audience went crazy, and as we finished with Pictures and Exhibition, Keith at the grand piano spinning around in the air before disappearing in a cloud of smoke. Now I ask you, who wouldn't have wanted to witness this magical performance? No one, of course, not even the critics who made a living disparaging ELP for their theatrics and risk-taking, even if they wouldn't bring themselves to admit it. They didn't hate Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They hated that they weren't Emerson, Lake and Palmer. It must have eaten them up to watch others bask in the glory of musical prowess while they fired insults from the sidelines. Another issue came from exposure. Americans simply weren't steeped in European classical music the way the English were. Humans naturally cling to the familiar, and at the heart of most judgmental criticism lies insecurity. Lester Bangs was fired from Rolling Stone in '73 for being disrespectful to musicians, but then jumped to other publications, repeating the cycle. He even went on to label ELP war criminals at one point. In 1982, at age 33, Bangs would be found dead in his apartment, a victim of mixing prescriptions with NyQuil during a bout of the flu. Reportedly, a Human League record he'd bought that day spun on the turntable, skipping over the same note again and again. Of course, critics dwell in all crevices of society, always ready with their harsh judgments as a way to assert control when they feel threatened, deciding who is acceptable and who is not. In the end, Emerson, Lake and Palmer's ambitious music outlasted the criticism, and the group achieved what they set out to do. They became an innovative band who broke free from conventions of the industry, taking experimentation to a new level in the studio and on stage. And the audiences who appreciated them were not stupid. They were forward-thinking listeners who heard what others hadn't caught on to. By ELP daring to ask the question, how do you innovate when you work in an industry that doesn't value experimentation? They transcended the conventional. Their work showed that rock music could push boundaries of complexity by adapting the past within a modern rock sound. For every artist who dared to ignore the limits placed on them, Emerson, Lake and Palmer proved it could be done, and that is the kind of legacy no review can erase.
I really haven't ever had time to think about hobbies, working all the time.
Hobbies, driving. I quite like driving, because I just bought a car. I haven't got many hobbies really,
I don't really have another hobby. I used to have a hobby in photography and fishing, but now I've only got time to devote my whole life to music.
Person.
It's clear in Greg's book that he felt some of the criticisms were unjustified and vicious. He was hurt, but to his credit, he never returns the favor, always showing grace and just trying to understand where it all came from. He also shares some jaw-dropping stories throughout his career and sweetly credits his wife and faith that saw him through. I highly recommend this book, which I'll link in the description and in the video, along with the albums discussed. I hope you enjoyed this video and will consider becoming a patron of the arts. You can support my work via the link in the description. Have a freewheeling day. Cheers!